The following is a talk by Professor Ravi Krishnaswami on March 26, 2024, hosted by the AI in the Liberal Arts Initiative. Scan the QR codes on screen to learn more, or go to www.liberal-arts.ai.
My name's Ari King. I am the program coordinator for the AI in the Liberal Arts program. We're a program out of the computer science department founded by computer science professor Lee Spector. And we're looking to engage a kind of broad interdisciplinary audience in critical conversations about this kind of new era of AI and its applications into all kinds of aspects of, art, the humanities and whatnot. Today we are hosting Ravi Krishnaswami. He's going to present his paper, Emotions on Demand, and that will be followed by kind of conversation with Professor Chris Grobe, who is also here, the director of the Center for Humanistic Inquiry, where we're being hosted today. And then we'll open it up for some questions. We'd love, audience engagement. So yeah, we're looking forward to that. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a few more events we have coming up, including next week on April 4th. We're welcoming, this is a virtual event. We're welcoming Aaron Kulada, who's the director of Tulane University's Center for Community Engaged AI. And so he's been working with some community groups in New Orleans, and he's going to talk about some of his work, as well as he'll be in conversation with two of our friends from UMass, Kirsten Helmer and Dan Kennedy from the Center for Teaching and Learning there. So that'll be a great conversation. You can go to the, if you Google Amherst AILA or Amherst AI in Liberal Arts, you'll find our website first thing, and you can find information on that and a link to RSVP. Also on April 11th, which is the following week, we're welcoming a philosophy professor here at Amherst, Joe Moore, and he's presenting a paper called The Antimony of Artificial Art. So he's talking about some of the kind of legalistic ideas and making the argument that AI can never be a true author. So it'll be a riveting conversation. That's at 2:30 over in Benesky in the Pano Lecture Hall. And again, you can find information about those events on our website. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ravi Krishnaswami here. He's a visiting professor in the Department of Music now, and he's going to share his paper, and then we'll have some conversation and audience questions. Thank you all for being here.
Please clap. Just a couple of caveats. How many of you here are computer scientists? Okay, so if you're a computer scientist, there's probably going to be a stretch early on where I sort of try to explain some things that are going on for mostly musicologists, and it may seem very simple to you. And so just bear with me on that. Is there any way to get a little more volume on the music samples? Is there any control over that? Okay. Yeah, if you could just, because they were a little quiet, just so people can hear what I'm playing. And so the other caveat is that, so you see I have Brown University on there. I'm actually ABD right now while I'm, while I'm teaching here. And this is part of my dissertation research. I'm in my first year of researching this topic. So this presentation is kind of a like, here's where I'm thinking of going, and there's a lot more to do kind of presentation, not a I've got it all figured out and kind of thing. And lastly, musicologists and people in the humanities sometimes give these papers where they actually read the paper, which is a little awkward, but I'm going to do that. So bear with me. Okay. Anyway, So AI music platform Soundful offers customers the opportunity to generate royalty-free background music at the click of a button for your videos, streams, podcasts, and much more. Dynascore offers a personal composer for users that need a 40-second version of an EDM track with transitions at 17 seconds and 28 seconds and an ending bump at 42 seconds. And Stable Audio proudly declares that it trained on opted-in music, paying the rights holders behind that music. So coming out of, I should have mentioned this, my career before going back to Brown and starting to teach was composing music for media for about 20 years, advertising, video games, television. So coming out of that career, I am simultaneously fascinated and horrified by how these products were created, their claims, and their implications on industries and people that I have been close to. AI music generation is a potentially disruptive force and a nascent industry awash in speculative money, much like the internet in the late 1990s. While I doubt it could ever rival an artist like Taylor Swift, I believe AI is poised to disrupt the functional music ecosystem, where music for media is bought and sold as a service and commodity. Musicologist Anahid Kasabian argues that we should pay more attention to what she calls ubiquitous music, because ubiquitous listening, the music that's in advertising and TV and the music that's around us in the built environment, is now a dominant form of listening, and it reveals the effective structures of our sensory world. So in this paper, I look at three recent products that bring automation and AI to the music for media industry. By placing them into a longer historical context of music technology and compositional methods, looking at the behaviors of their interfaces, that their interfaces encourage and discourage, and by listening to their outputs, I hope to better understand what is happening in the industry and whether its claims are valid. I hope this paper raises questions that my ongoing dissertation research will address. My starting point is a suspicion about the incentive structures behind music AI projects and their exploitation of gray areas in intellectual property law. Generative AI provides its owners vast power to harvest value from the knowledge contained within its data sets. Not surprisingly, a vigorous debate has started about what kind of compensation and permission might be necessary to train on publicly available data. At a recent meeting of the Production Music Association, which is a trade association for stock music libraries, library owners were concerned that if compositions and master recordings produced by these systems are understood to be ownable and licensable assets for their developers, then generative AI promises to increase the supply of new compositions competing in the functional music marketplace to infinity, marginalizing composers of custom and stock music. In contrast, at a recent copyright board listening session held on this topic, Kenneth Doroshow, representing the RIAA, declared, "Our member companies have made it very clear that they are open for business to discuss licenses for their catalogs for use by legitimate AI businesses," meaning the record industry, publishing industry is very willing to receive a check to have their catalogs provide training data. So while this all sounds very nefarious, the field is full of tensions, in my view. When I interviewed a senior engineer working on audio at Adobe, I asked him why he got into this work, and he told me about all the bands he used to play in while growing up in Spain. I was like, okay, I'm either going to do some more like artistic career, or I'm going to do something that has to do with computers, even though I didn't know how to program that much back then. And then maybe have like on the side some more artistic things going on. So this is one person I talked to, but it's actually a pretty common theme that comes up in a lot of the people that I talk to and a lot of the press coverage that I've been analyzing from companies. And who would blame a young software engineer, somebody who might be in this room right now, that grew up with a passion for music, from choosing a career in AI music where there's a thriving job market right now? So while venture capitalists rarely study the labor ecologies whose destruction their investments thrive on, It is also true that musicians have always embraced new technologies. The music industry has endured the recording ban of 1942, a reaction to the replacement of live radio musicians. Anxieties about the synthesizer and the drum machine. I think the synthesizer was actually banned in the UK for a little while. And massive legal and financial disruptions due to sampling and file sharing. This paper just tries to hold these tensions between creation and destruction together. So a little bit of history. The romance between music and artificial intelligence has a rich history. David Cope's Alice and Emmy projects, which aim to understand Bach by recreating him, and George Lewis's Voyager, an attempt to understand improvisation by creating an improviser, are two, I feel, are two of the most influential and thorough precedents. Both projects use statistical methods such as Markov chains to model musicians' decision-making process, essentially saying if the musician did A, B, and C, then statistically speaking, the musician will probably do D next. The current boom in activity, however, is an outgrowth of the availability of much more powerful computers than either Cope or Lewis had access to. This computing power has made deep learning accessible to researchers in audio and music. A very basic way to describe deep learning, and I'm emphasizing basic for the computer scientists, is that many processors are used as perceptrons, which work like neurons, processing inputs, which might be small fractions of sensory information, into outputs through a collaborative process. And this is sort of a very basic drawing of how perceptrons work together. Furthermore, large language models can be used for manipulating any information, including musical descriptions and metadata, by turning them into semantic tokens. LLMs and deep learning have shifted the focus from highly sophisticated rule-based algorithms about making music to a more black-boxed approach, shifting the developer's role from creating musical rules to creating data sets that might reflect or produce musical rules rather than creating the rules themselves. So that's an important distinction to me, where a lot of these projects are about feeding it a lot of material and letting it figure out on its own how music works. The most important outcome, or the most interesting outcome right now of increased computing power is the development of generative audio, which means creating audio directly from text prompts and training on data sets of audio files, which are usually ingested and tagged using machine listening techniques. So while symbolic systems usually create MIDI data, which can then be orchestrated with virtual instruments or even performed by live instruments, as Cope's music was, generative audio systems create new master recordings from scratch without any understanding of what they are, but with all of the sonic detail that music producers control in the process of recording, mixing, and mastering. So in his recent book, anthropologist Nick Seaver describes how computer scientists see themselves and their role in musicking. Many of the industry actors working on generative systems come out of the music information retrieval community, also known as MIR, a group of researchers who work with symbolic data like key, tempo, melody, harmony, and rhythm, but also descriptive metadata such as emotional adjectives, think aggressive, romantic, dark, optimistic. And for prompt-based music generation in particular, this language-based interface is what makes the systems usable without any musical training or knowledge. The origins of their data set and the ground truth in that data set thus becomes the only way to understand who the system is as a composer and how it thinks. Edward Kang suggests a methodology called ground truth tracing when looking critically at data sets used for applications that claim to use artificial intelligence to understand things like emotion and affect. In his teardown of a product claiming to monitor the emotional state of customer service representatives speaking to customers on the telephone, he argues that there is simply no way to generalize there's no way to establish a generalizable ground truth when it comes to the emotional quality of speech, calling these machine listening techniques the translation and flattening of a messy qualitative problem into a usable quantitative reference. So I would extend this critique to musical descriptors that involve emotion. What systems of thought do these descriptors reinforce in a generative system? As Jonathan Stern argues, any theory of the listening in machine listening needs to also be a theory of power. So we should want to know how these data sets represent the relationship between music and affect. So that's my theoretical literature review section, and let's listen to some. Let's look at some of the platforms now. So let's look at Soundful first. Aimed squarely at the advertising industry, Soundful's symbolic system is narrow in stylistic scope, but what it does produce sounds pretty good. Responding to the uncertain legal status currently of AI-generated works as copyrightable and thus licensable material, Soundful reassures professional media creators that the musical DNA of their outputs can only be traced back to the company, asserting that our AI is not trained on previously copyrighted material, but instead based on music theory and foundation provided by our in-house production team. Thus, creators can be sure the works do not raise copyright issues in their usage. Similar to stock music companies, Soundful's user interface invites users to select from a handful of curated styles. Soundful then generates a set of options which users can pick from. And now we get to listen to some of them. So this is an emotional Latin track. That sample is glitchy, so don't worry, it's not the system. Okay. Here's a reggaeton track. Pretty funky harmony, if you ask me. And here's what's called world trap. So the options are simple in terms of structure, usually just looping an A section. The user is given very few tools for revising the outputs. As you can see on this slide, this is sort of the interface that you get once it's generated. Soundful's founder, Dia El Al, is unique among those I've interviewed so far in that he is actually from the music industry rather than computer science. Prior to starting the company, he had been a successful EDM and pop producer. He was emphatic when he told me that we're musicians by trade, the core engineering team. We understand what sounds good. So in our interview, he talked up the ethical choice of using in-house producers in the development of the product and the star producers that have significant credits to their name who can be hired using their new collab option, which is available for an additional fee. So you pay a little bit more and you can work with one of these producers who have credits in the industry, but you're not really working with them. You're working with something that's been maybe fine-tuned on their work or includes MIDI instruments and effect settings that they've curated. So obviously in researching the company, they're not going to give me full access to how they're building this, but I'm sort of putting the pieces together as I go. So let's look at Stable Audio now. Stable Audio is the product of OpenAI, the large Microsoft-funded corporation behind ChatGPT, and claims to be pursuing an ethical approach to generative AI by licensing Audio Sparks, which is actually a large British-owned stock music library designed for television and other media. Of course, OpenAI doesn't actually mention whether Audio Sparks composers were compensated as part of the deal for training on their data, only that the library was. And I think that this is I write this in this paper because we take it at face value when companies say we license this library, that the composers within the library are getting paid. But I've worked in the industry long enough to be very skeptical that that's happening unless the writers are coming out and saying that it's happening. So in contrast with projects such as Google's MusicGen, which uses data culled from YouTube, Stable Audio's use of Audio Sparks has a couple of advantages. First, it is already tagged with detailed metadata, including genre, style, emotion, and even television usage contexts. Google's generative model dataset, by contrast, required extensive tagging by hand. And actually, so when looking into Google's dataset, this is a screenshot from the page. It's actually pretty crazy what they're training their model on. It's like really weird material from YouTube. That's not even actually, they're not even actually ingesting a lot of the metadata from the videos themselves. Because I found, for example, a Hindustani singer, and it was only tagged classical in the data set. It didn't have any other classical voice. It didn't have any regional metadata associated with it. So one of the things you have to know also is when you start to play through like stuff like this, the quality is very low, the sound quality. So Stable Audio's usage of a TV library ensures that their stuff is actually mixed and mastered and sonically a lot better than some of what Google's been doing. Let's listen to some of the outputs, and I want to take a moment to highlight George Henry, who's a student here, undergrad, who's been working with me on doing some testing. And so a lot of these test outputs have been produced by him, and also Daniel Flores Garcia. So this is what's called, we looked for an exotic track. Actually really interesting. It's like bad in a good way, perhaps, but okay. Here's a classy track. Okay, and one more. This is an urban track. We use this, and I'm going to tell you about why we're using these prompts in a second. So these results are pretty poor, but it's also tricky to present research like this because it's dipping your finger into a stream. It's not going to be the same. The model is continuing to evolve. So I don't know what you'll get, but I can tell you about why we're using these words. I tested keywords which, in my experience, often carried cultural biases in television usage contexts. So I can't tell you how many times, I would work on like a jewelry store ad, and it would have to be classical music. And why couldn't it be, R&B, for example? And this gets to sort of looking behind the scenes and saying, okay, they're testing on a television library. So what kind of assumptions are going to be made, and how does that get through the semantic understanding of music inside of them? So besides length, Stable Audio's UI only offers guidance about prompts, meaning that the process is much like image diffusion models, where you refine prompts until you get close to something. The inability to apply musical concepts and terminology to the revision workflow makes stable audio allergic to musical expertise and more suited to curation via prompt engineering. So let's look at the last find, Dynascore. So I first learned about Dynascore through a former composition student of mine. I've taught composition in a program for a long time. He was commissioned to write library tracks for the company. Working for creative director Peter Lerman, a composer with credits in television and on Broadway, composers were given specific creative briefs and asked to deliver tracks that included detailed stems, which are the individual audio tracks for each instrument, along with MIDI data when MIDI instruments were used. They were also provided specific sample libraries to write with. So if you know a little bit about music production, that means that what they were essentially given was like a system of they were delivering not just stereo mixes, but toolkits based on the music that they had written. So Dynascore is marketed to the advertising producer and media creator that wants that it's not advertising to the producer that wants endless options, but rather to the video editor and content creator who wants the experience of customizing the timing of sections in a cue to correspond to visual changes. So in fact, rather than a standalone website accessed through a browser like the other examples I showed, Dynascore is actually designed as a plugin to be hosted within Adobe Premiere. And you can see it's available in the Premiere store. Dynascore's business model involved a $500,000 investment in its custom library of 1,000 tracks purchased for $500 each for unlimited usage. A small team was hired to produce the tracks, so each composer was probably able to earn a significant payment by delivering in volume. Drawing on my experience as a composer for video games and connecting the dots with the types of files the composers were asked to deliver, I believe much of the actual functionality of Dynascore is indistinguishable from dynamic music systems made possible by game engines such as Fmod and Wise. By splicing up a track into loopable beds, stems, and one-shot stings, the system allows the video editor to play the track the way a player in a video game might. So you can see this is sort of the interface you're given by the plugin, where you can kind of see a map of the energy of the track, and you can put in some markers. So what I'm going to do is, if you all don't mind, I'm going to play like a very enthusiastic, possibly Plant from YouTube, somebody who is like testing this platform out, because he does give a pretty succinct like walkthrough of how the interface works. I have a feeling he was planted by the company to generate interest. Oops. Let's see.
It onto your computer. You can then have two options on how to use it. One is a Spotify-esque type app, and the other one is actually an extension within Adobe Premiere Pro. First one I'm going to show you is the extension within Adobe Premiere Pro. All right, so I'm going to give this a little bit of a challenge. I shot this little vlog yesterday where we went to go visit my grandma out at her senior's home. We couldn't actually go see her because there's like a lockdown here in Canada. So what I'm going to try and do is just put like Dynascore to the test. So I'll put like a little endpoint here. I'm so obsessed on how this software works. I think it's so cool. And let's see, it ends with me like talking. Okay, so oopsies. So then we'll put our endpoint there. And then I'm going to open up the extension, Dynascore, and then I'm going to create a new track. I found this track through the app, Just Be, and we're going to pop it in. Okay, and now I'm going to make my sort of key marks. I kind of want to make my transition points, I guess, at key parts. So got our opening, so the track play, and I think when we see grandma, that should be like a little point here. So we'll do like a transition point there. Dominic at the window here. And you don't, the thing is with like music tracks and putting them in, you don't have to always have like the beat on the cut. You can always have them in different spots. And in fact,
That's actually a pretty good insight from scoring videos.
Let's see here. And then I'm gonna completely contrast what I said just there to really emphasize the cut you put music in, but they don't always have to play. So I'm gonna pop this bad boy here, and then grandma shows up to see Dominic. There's like the key moment, and then I think like another beat right here with Kim crying. I think this is good. Dominic there sad, and then we'll put like sort of end part here when I wave goodbye. So now I can go into here, choose this as the dinosaur. So all my transition points need to be white markers. So I'll go in and change all of these to being white. Let's give this a little hack. Let's hack this baby. See what happens. I'm excited. I'm excited to see how this place on a sequence. Kaboom. Let's see what happens. Hi, Grandma. It's like, that's so magic. Oh, and the hit when she comes to the window. This is awesome. This is so good. Oh man, this is great. What? I'm sorry. The transition there. Oh, my baby.
So it's like,
So here's the thing about that.
okay, all right, enough. So as I said in the beginning, mixture of fascination and horror, being horrified at, sort of seeing what you would lovingly do with your hands as a craft, scoring film and kind of just having it turned into this this plugin tool, which they do in their marketing say that they use some AI in how they figure out how to time sections. But then what I think a lot of it is more of a game-like thing under the hood. So anyway, let's wrap this up. So Dynascore, Soundful, and Stable Audio each define the problem of music for media differently. Stable Audio focuses on novelty, Soundful focuses on production quality, and Dynascore focuses on customizability. Each seems to be betting on different guesses about where media creators might want agency generating music. In this quick overview, I've also shown how each company claims an ethical approach to developing their products, not problems. Problems for some people. Soundful has employed producers to build their product, creating automated versions of composers and their tastes. Dynascore has purchased new tracks from composers at a low but legitimate price, turning them into responsive game-like scores. And Stability has licensed a large stock library for its generative audio training model. So why do I still sense an ick in all of these ethical approaches? Aside from Soundful's collabs, these companies all monetize the work of composers without offering them much in the way of a sustainable career, the ability to build their own brands within the industry. And they are middlemen that can't exist without the knowledge and experience of their invisible workforce. A further concern raised by Stability's product, which is also marketed to listeners, general listeners, as well as media creators, is the notion that music generated for listeners might be built upon a music library built-in tag to be used for television production. As music theorist Phil Tagg has laid out in his tomb-like volume, which you should not read because it's way too long, called Music's Meanings, music for television taps into a deep wellspring of conditioning through audiovisual media. For example, last example, the sound of a drone and a sitar would not be surprising in a television scene where a character has taken a psychedelic drug, right? Even though Hindustani music is not at all directly related to hallucination. So while composers may navigate these choices and associations in real time, changing them over time, how might a system of audio generation built on top of television-specific metadata harden such associations? In Algorithms of Oppression, Sophia Noble, a scholar who, like myself, spent some years in the advertising industry, draws our attention to the commercial co-optation of Black identities, experiences, and communities by media and tech companies. Her work informs my future research into coded words that I've heard over many years as a professional composer, words such as urban, aggressive, or intelligent. But even if metadata-induced bias is not an issue, generative AI represents a massive leap in the efficiency within which the music and tech industries can exploit communities of practice and disrupt labor ecosystems. So right now, these issues are unaddressed by the law, so it's left to scholars and activists to look into them. Thank you.
Um, Thank you for sharing that research. And I'm just going to ask a few questions to get us started, and then we'll just open it up to the floor. And I just first have some really practical questions about process. And one of them just occurred to me now. So that demo video where he mentions a lockdown.
Mhm.
So are all of these products things that began during when time period are we talking about here?
Dynascore is probably the oldest of
Yeah.
the platforms, because that got started around COVID, or like around 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a horrible materialist, and I just like that's still in the era of low interest rates in tech. And I
Mhm.
do wonder if the ethical commitments such as they are have survived the more recent collapse of the tech industry and all the layoffs. But that's just sorry, that's okay, just establishing some facts. Um
Totally.
other facts. So how did you end up actually selecting and approaching subjects? You know, you ended up interviewing people or selecting particular platforms.
Yeah, so you know, I'm a musicologist and ethnomusicologist, and as an ethnomusicologist, I want to talk to people
Mm-hmm.
and understand how they're thinking about what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this sort of broad definition of music, this term musicking that, you know, we kind of think about, where I see these business owners and developers, software engineers, as musicking.
Mm-hmm.
It's an expansive definition. So I want to kind of understand what brought them into that work. How I actually met them it's been mostly organic,
Mm-hmm.
in different ways. So um, I traveled to the ISMIR conference, which is
Mm-hmm.
like the big tech conference for people who are working in this space. And I just hung out and got to know people. I was very transparent that I was kind of like, I'm not here to give a paper. I'm here to kind of study you. And I think, you know, the funny thing about the industry is that everybody on an individual basis is very open to talking.
Unless they work at Apple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were two guys there from Apple, and they were very unapproachable.
Yeah.
But yeah, people are, because they don't really, they're not really looking at this on the like labor ecosystem scale. They're looking at this through the lens of their own personal journey into technology, and sort of working on something that's cool and interesting. And so, and I think, and like every single person I've met in the industry, as I've talked to them, has said, you know, I don't want to build something that replaces composers. I want to build something that composers can use. We want to build technologies that are co-creative.
Mm-hmm.
They're not always, that's what they say is not always aligned with what their employers are actually doing, but
Yeah. So I know from personal experience with cognate research on people with backgrounds in theater and film who work in like chatbot and digital voice assistant design, that as you say, so many people in the space are would-be artists or moonlighting artists. And my personal experience is that I had to navigate how I approached them, either as like you, I'm an artist turned academic, so as a fellow artist or as a scholar studying them. And I wonder how you also kind of approached that in terms of presenting yourself, projecting your identity, managing that relationship. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting because it's, you know, so I'm very upfront about
Mm-hmm.
the fact that I did this as a career. And in fact, so like I learned in my theory and methods, in my theory and methods class in ethnomusicology at Brown, which is taught by Jeffrey's friend, Josh Tucker at Brown. We talked about, when you go into the field, what the conversation is and can you offer something back to that field?
Right.
And so in fact, with some of the conversations that I've had, I've beta tested some products because they're looking for composers who have worked professionally to actually tell them, does this thing do anything that interests you, or which direction would you like to see it go in?
Right.
So I've kind of offered that up, as as a way to kind of be a participant in the industry while studying them. And but I'll give you one anecdote, which is at the Izmir conference there was a sort of a discussion on human-centered AI. And we were kind of going around the room. It was me with a lot of people who are working at places like Steinberg, which makes Cubase and other audio software, and people from Spotify, ByteDance. And as I was telling them about what I do, I said, in my years of working in advertising, I've met a lot of people who I think if they could press a button and have the track done and not deal with me as a composer, would do it in a second.
Yeah.
And everybody like people were genuinely shocked that that was the case. It was vague, like they couldn't have imagined that existed out there. And I was like, oh no, people are going to use this and it's not going to be co-creative. It's going to replace a lot of work.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you. That's really good context. And now, because I'm coming from the English department, I have to ask about the centrality of text to this model and indeed to all Gen AI models right now. It seems like so much the new norm right now of text-based prompting, and in particular, in most cases, of a sort of defamiliarizing, like learning a kind of defamiliarized approach to language, where you begin to treat it as almost a kind of code in the way that you did when, I don't know, you first used a search engine or something. Sorry, I'm dating both of us here, but like, you had to learn to use language in a different way, right? Yeah, right. And so I wonder, just opening up to your reflections on the different ways in which text is central to this, and why that is, and how that does or does not relate to the way that like musicians or musicologists use language to describe music or to provoke music, etc.
I mean, it's like if you make music and you love music, you often talk about like music saying things that can't be said with words. And like, that's a very common thing that I've heard people say, like music speaks in an emotional language that, you can't be, that can't be captured by language. So in some ways, like the critical look at this is like, how is this going to change our relationship with music, both as listeners and as creators? So for one thing, like in the presentation, I talked about the fact that the only revision in stable audio is prompt engineering.
Right.
And so what that really does is it sort of puts the focus on like music is something that you can create through your imagination. There's no embodied experience to it. It's this cerebral task. And I think you lose the embodied experience and the social experience of making music in this way.
It's almost like it's something you order, both in the sense that like you command the engine to do this thing, but also like you order it up as a customer, and that, I guess, is one way of expressing how co-creativity is not actually the model there. Or I don't know. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also think that there, I think that there's a way in which this stuff, once it's unleashed, it may just be that it opens up a new way of thinking about
Yeah.
what music making is. And if you're older and you grew up only with the old way, maybe you kind of scoff at it. And
Yeah.
you know, I'm always hyper aware too of like my very first year at a jingle studio. I remember coming in and there was a guy there, Robert Miller. He's still working. He's a legend. He's done like 1 million Coke commercials for the Super Bowl
Mhm.
with polar bears and everything. He's the orchestral guy.
Mhm.
And he had a big easel and he wrote on paper.
Mm.
And I remember coming in there and getting my start using a DAW, digital performer,
Mhm.
and thinking like, well, I'm not a composer. I'm just moving stuff around in the computer. Now that's a composer. That's like really doing it. And so I'm aware that there was, you know, that there may be, you know, maybe the prompt engineer is going to look at me that way. Oh, that guy can open up a DAW and actually knows what notes are, you know. So there might be, you know, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What I'm just zooming out kind of far. I know you said, I love that image of, you know, just sort of dipping your finger in the stream and never feeling like you have a, you know, once and for all view of your subject, the thing you're studying. So, you know, with that caveat aside, you know, what have you noticed so far, you know, beyond questions of, you know, bias? What have you noticed so far in terms of what these engines make possible or leave impossible, or like aspects of music or musicking that are like highlighted or hidden by the way that these things have been designed? From your perspective as somebody who, you know, sort of has made this kind of music yourself.
Yeah. Well, so I think I've already mentioned like the, you know, they can generate a piece of music, but then to intelligently revise it
Yeah.
and um it's very limited. I mean, obviously in Dynascore you can see you can retime sections. But like, you know, I would be working on some project and somebody'd be like, can you make the last 20 seconds a little darker? You know, and I don't know that these systems really, you know, have that way of understanding structure and transitions. They know how to because they don't understand anything. They just they just statistically approximate or you know, I don't know what we need a new vocabulary for what they do. But you know, I would say that acoustic instruments are particularly hard to do, but I've just heard the new Suno model do like they typed in Mississippi Delta blues. This is on a podcast by Rolling Stone. It came out 2 days ago, and they play this example where it's like a Mississippi Delta blues track that it was generated by this thing. And so I'm going to say that timbre is getting closer and closer to being good. But I think what I really think that these systems, one of the big things they don't seem to be able to kind of figure out is that music is a time-based medium, and that like you can tell it, okay, extend this by 30 seconds, extend it. And a lot of times it's just looping or maybe goes into some different section. But if you've composed a longer piece, you know how much thought goes into what ideas you introduce early on, how you vary them later. There's a whole architecture to writing a longer piece of music that they're nowhere near really understanding. And from what I've seen going to a conference like Izmir and seeing the latest papers on music analysis of structure, it was totally fascinating to go to that conference while teaching the Music 111, which is the, you know, the entry into understanding and analyzing music and understanding theory, because a lot of the understanding of musical structure is just at that stage, that Music 111 stage of like, okay, here's an A section and here's a B section. And can we identify what do we hear that can, how do we listen to this piece of music to know if we're in the A section or the B section, what happens? That's where the music analysis is right now in the industry. But
Right.
everybody in the industry will say, well, it'll get better.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's open it up. And do you want me passing this mic around? Or?
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thanks, Ravi. Just to follow up on a bunch of points that emerged in the discussion, I'm wondering about like deeper futures and how the kind of financial forces behind these might be thinking about scaling. And two issues that emerged were the actual, corpus that is being trained off of, or the music theoretical for the one that was sort of like, don't worry, this is no copyright risk because we're feeding it sort of like neutral, unownable music theoretical objects, or the English language centeredness, default hegemony that's behind all of this. To me, both of those are sort of like impediments to scale in terms of, give me something that's in a maqam rather than like this tuning, or the kind of timbral palette of things that it's not trained on. So I'm wondering, like, to get beyond like a very niche North Atlantic market, how, like, what are people thinking about that, about scaling, about getting beyond the prompting game based on English?
That's interesting. I haven't seen a prompting interface that's outside of that's not in English, because for better or for worse, I went to this was an international conference in Italy, and there were people from all over the world, and all the papers were in English and everybody spoke in English. It was the lingua franca of computer science research, at least at this conference. And so I didn't see anything in terms of the interface being outside of English. But I did see there's a lot of interest in like places like India and China, which have large research institutions that can fund this kind of research. There are teams coming out of India, China, Japan, that are trying to analyze non-Western musics. And so a lot of this now is about, it's not really about how do you do it, it's about how do we build the data set for it? Where is the data set? And then there are, I saw a paper on analyzing Carnatic vocal performance, which was super interesting. But of course, you talk to people in the industry too, and the projects that they develop at the university may not be the projects that they end up working on when they get hired out of the university. And there's a there's an interesting dynamic that happens where people are kind of going into these music AI programs with really interesting ideas, and very very high goals, to kind of, either to address, some need in the field. And then they get hired at Adobe or Spotify, and they're working on, how to create sound design and music in your video, and that's it. So I don't know. I would imagine that it will get better for those kind of the countries I saw at the conference.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question was, so thinking about, I have very little background in music, but when I think about like categorizations of music, I wonder if the nature of the prompting. You prompt by a category that, as you mentioned, has connotations that are based off of cultural context. That do these programs have any kind of ramifications for new genres forming, like fusions forming? Because I can imagine that if there's a pre-existing context that was something like, when you said carnatic music, I was thinking of this like guy, I forgot his name, who does like carnatic jazz fusions, like stuff like that. That seems kind of hard to prompt an AI to do if it doesn't already exist, if there's not data to train it on. So is that kind of thing made less possible by like reifying existing categories, or is it made maybe even more possible by allowing it to, I don't know, allowing more repetition faster by having more information to choose from? I don't know. I'm just curious on that and its consequences.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that. One thing I would say is that brings up a really interesting thing that I should be looking at in testing systems going forward is sort of testing. You're talking about newer genres or emerging genres, testing those to see what kinds of maybe descriptive or emotional words do to those genres. It would be really interesting to test that. I will say that like my experience so far is that a lot of these systems kind of reflect whether the pool of material they trained on is deep or shallow, and that, like, so a lot of systems, if you tell it to give you, to tell it I want an EDM track, I mean, you can get really good, sounding stuff because it's been trained on a lot of material. And you say I want polka, and it's really glitchy because it hasn't really trained on much. But that's a great question. And one of the things I'm also interested in, which nobody really talks about, is they'll talk about, whether their data was acquired fairly or not, but they don't talk about whether they feel any sort of responsibility to keep training the system or to just stop and let it, do its own thing based on whatever they put in. I know as a TV composer, you had to keep your library updated. There were, you couldn't just stop writing music in 2005 and use that library to pitch to companies. You needed newer sounding stuff. So what do these companies, do they feel do they have any sort of plan, any sort of like sustainability plan for keeping the model relevant? Or on the flip side, are they planning to train on their own outputs, which is totally crazy to think about, but I think people are doing that. So it's a great question.
Is the industry doing anything to like prevent future like data cannibalism that might occur if like we reduce the amount of people in the space, right? And then AI ends up like continuously just being trained on other AI music. Like what's going to happen to the music industry?
Yeah, if I had a crystal ball, the industry is not at all, the industry that I encountered at Izmir feels that a lot of these questions are outside of their what they're actually there to do, which is to figure out, how to make their model, use less, run faster, use less processing power, sound better, understand some new trick. There's not a lot of discussion about how this impacts music on a larger scale. And I will say that I included that anecdote from the copyright listening session because it was very clear to me that the music industry has its own agenda, which is not necessarily aligned with what we might all want out of the music industry. It's aligned with what maximizes the value of their assets. So they wield a lot of power in terms of like offering up their catalogs for training. So I'm kind of rambling now, but what's interesting is that most of these companies, they have 12, internship spots for data scientists, computer, software engineers, machine learning engineers. They don't really offer too many internships to musicologists or to people who have any sort of knowledge of the arts and public policy. So I think what we'll see is going to reflect that. And I also think, I mean, the one thing I will predict is that many of the platforms that I'm studying won't be around in 5 years. It'll kind of the bubble will pop, and but a lot of this, that's when it gets even scarier, because a lot of this technology will be sort of built into our sonic world without even thinking about it. So this is kind of the moment to study it, because it's when people are really talking about how to build it.
This will be our last question.
Thank you for your presentation. So in terms of the sort of like genre tagging and such that you talked about, I'd love to know in your experience what the overlap has been with genre tagging on streaming platforms like Spotify. Because at least to my understanding and in my experience, Spotify in particular has been very big into like this very obsessive, detailed genre tagging, emotion tagging, mood tagging of all of their music that predates a lot of this. So I'm wondering if, in your experience, if these models and in these companies are basing it off of like maybe older or at least older fashioned sample libraries, or if they're collaborating with streaming services that have sort of a more in-depth or codified way of assigning those labels, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I don't know that I have the kind of access deep within the bowels of a Spotify or OpenAI to kind of know what those conversations look like yet. But I would like to know. But I will say that so another big push for Spotify is their sort of really shifting music from like the music listening from a curatorial, like identity building experience of like, I listen to this band, and this band, and you listen to the same bands that I do, to be more like, this is what I'm going to listen to when I want to wake up in the morning, and this is what I want to listen to when I want to wind down in the evening. And so I do think that it seems like they're investing heavily into this sort of emotional, affective tagging, and it might be good for, it might align with a lot of people, but I mean, there's a philosophical argument underneath what I'm doing, which is that you can't really state that this track is going to make you feel this way. That is just not something that you can pin down, because it's way too contextual. And I did this, like, I went down this rabbit hole on, like, I wanted to look, as an advertising composer, I wanted to look at what the literature was in marketing journals on music, and because they spend money and spend a lot of time torturing me in the studio to get the tone just right for the commercial. And I'm like, what, where does their research come from? And you kind of follow this trail of like citations all the way back to these really wacky studies from like the early 20th century, where they, right after the invention of the gramophone, where they're like, oh, we can test how people feel when they listen to music, because now we can use the same record in multiple tests. And so you get these studies that are like, 100 white male business students at this college listened to these 12 classical records and wrote on a card whether they made them feel happy or sad. And that is like, that gets laundered down through psychology literature to be just like, okay, well, this is what we know about music and emotion, and it's bizarre. So anyway, I think it's a really interesting question. It's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, Anyway, that's time for us. Ravi and Chris, thank you so much for Ravi, thank you for sharing your work, and Chris, thank you for engaging in this conversation.